Tonight on Talking Politics, the crucial role the U.S. Senate race in New Hampshire could play in deciding the national balance of power. The winner of the contest between incumbent Democrat Maggie Hassan and Trump-supporting Republican Don Bolduc could determine control of the Senate. Are Democrats underestimating the allure of Trump's brand of republicanism in New England? We'll get into that ahead, but first to the case of Adam Howe, who died by suicide in a Bristol County jail over the weekend. He'd been arrested on Friday in Truro after police said he killed his mother in the house where they both lived and then set her body on fire in the front lawn. After he was taken to a nearby hospital for a physical issue, the Cape and Islands DA wanted Howe, who has a history of mental illness, to be committed to another facility, Bridgewater State Hospital, for a mental health evaluation. But according to the DA, a hospital administrator declined to admit Howe, who was instead taken to Ash Street Jail in New Bedford. There he was put on security watch and checked on every 15 minutes by a corrections officer, but obviously that was not enough. Cases like this are all too common in Bristol County, which accounted for 13% of all inmates in county correction facilities, but more than a quarter of all suicides from 2006 to 2016, according to a report from the Center for Investigative Reporting here at GBH News. The Boston Globe editorial board called the DOC's decision to send Howe to Ash Street Jail tragic and urged an investigation of his case and more scrutiny of the county's track record overall. I'm joined now by the paper's assistant editorial editor, Pulitzer-nominated opinion writer Rochelle Cohen, who's also on the board of the Mass Association for Mental Health, and by Elizabeth Matos, the executive director of Prisoners Legal Services of Massachusetts. Thank you both for being here. Shelley, I want to start with you. There are a number of actors in this story. We sketched it out in the intro, but didn't get into how complicated it is. There's the judge, Bridgewater State Hospital, the state police, who said they tried to put Adam Howe in one prison, one jail, but couldn't, so they put him in another. And there are a number of places where things seem to go really badly wrong. I know that a full investigation has not yet occurred, but what's your sense of whether a particular entity or entities deserve the majority of the blame?
Well, let's throw into that mad mixture. All of this is happening at about 3 a.m.
Yeah.
That's when this tragic sequence of events begins. Should Adam Howe have ended up in the custody of Bristol County? No. They don't have a good track record. And he was in the throes of a mental health crisis. Mm-hmm. He belonged in a secure mental health facility. My issue, and as the editorial raised, the real issue was at Bridgewater, which is now run, its clinical staff is a private, nonprofit contractor to the state. So someone at Bridgewater in the middle of the night looks at the judge's orders, said, this doesn't come under the right rubric. We can't take him under this. Sorry, end of story. According to O'Keefe, and I did speak to him.
The Cape and Islands DA, for people who might not be familiar.
Yes, sorry, Michael O'Keefe has been very forthcoming on this. Said, we'll get the judge on the phone. We'll get the doctor on the phone. That's where I think things went horribly wrong.
Elizabeth, would you agree with Shelley's assessment, or do you have a different take on what maybe the root problem seems to have been here?
I don't disagree at all. However, of course, they should have gotten the 18A from the beginning, right? That was possible. He could have been committed under 18A and not had the order for the Section 12 to begin with. But also, I would say, Bridgewater certainly mentioned that they didn't have authority to accept him under Section 12, but could accept him under a Section 18A. And at that point, either Bridgewater or the DA could have called the judge back and said, we're here, this is the situation, we need an 18A, and it could have been rectified at that moment.
I was not familiar with the different sections of law used to commit people, and I spent some time before our conversation just reading up on them. I am not a lawyer, but I was struck by the fact that it did seem that Section 12 was the wrong mechanism to have used. But as both of you have pointed out, that does not mean that the institution could not have decided to work with people to prevent a really terrible situation from unfolding. Shelley, the Globe...
That's just it.
Oh, go ahead.
There could have been a negotiation. There is, and not to get too jargony here.
Oh, please.
There is Section 15. Under Section 15, it says the court may commit. Now, is the court, is that a judge in the middle of the night negotiating over the phone, an emergency judge on call, negotiating with a superintendent on call at Bridgewater? Does that constitute a Section 15 under the best of circumstances? And that's also, I'm not a lawyer either, but that's the question that kind of looms large.
You quoted O'Keefe in the editorial saying sometimes the law is an ass. And it seems to me that when you're dealing with a situation as intensely horrific as this one, there should be institutional flexibility when it comes to trying to accommodate a number of people
so think
more bad things don't occur. Shelley, the Globe editorial suggested the fact that Bridgewater State is run by the Department of Corrections as opposed to the Department of Mental Health is a bigger overarching issue that really needs to be addressed. Why is that the setup? And I probably shouldn't admit this on camera. I actually didn't even realize that that was the case until I read the editorial. Why is it arranged that way?
Well, it's Bridgewater has, since it was founded, and it has a very sad history, has always been a Department of Corrections facilities for dealing with seriously mental ill prisoners. There is no comparable facility outside of DOC that can deal with that population. Prisoner advocates have long advocated for the Department of Mental Health to take over the facility. It's kind of a hybrid now, and it's clearly not working. I mean, the Disability Law Center has been at Bridgewater, monitoring Bridgewater under both a court settlement and under instructions from the legislature to sort of inspect periodically services rendered at Bridgewater. And they have been very unhappy both with the physical plant and with the level of care delivered. So it's been their suggestion for the past several years, at least, that it be turned over to the Department of Mental Health. And this is Shelley Cohen speaking for Shelley Cohen, not for the Boston
Understood.
Globe. I have not been convinced until this case came along, and I'm now in the persuadable category on that issue.
Elizabeth, is there any momentum among lawmakers who could actually force a change like that to make the shift that Shelley was just discussing? Has anyone filed legislation that would do it, or is anyone even talking about filing a bill?
People have been talking about it for decades, actually. There's been legislation filed time and again to make Bridgewater State Hospital a DMH facility. And I would say, although some changes were made years ago so that the care providers have more autonomy in situations of mental health crisis and mental health care generally, I would say it's still not operating independently at all in that way, and it still operates very much like a prison. I think there's a little more momentum recently because of some of the reporting. The DLC, again, did a report somewhat recently highlighting some of the issues that have been endemic to Bridgewater State Hospital for a very long time. We've been involved in litigation around excessive use of restraints and other kinds of segregation and solitary confinement practices there that are incredibly troubling. And also, it's important to point out that we are one of the only states that has a hospital like this run by a prison. And what you get is a prison, not a hospital, because you've undeniably a lot of interference with how things are run. And so it doesn't end up being run like a hospital and like it should. And also, I wanted to point out, as we mentioned, the confusion between Section 12 and Section 18. I think that highlights the problem that we're seeing here, which is that someone is in mental health crisis and it shouldn't be so complicated to get someone help. And it made sense to everyone that he should have been at Bridgewater State Hospital. But because the system is cumbersome, People couldn't quite figure out how to get him there. And the other thing that's really important to mention here is that Bristol could have sectioned him as well. They could have sent him under an 18A to Bridgewater as soon as he got there. They had the power to do so. They should have done so, given all of the facts that were very clear, including his well-documented suicidal ideation that was pronounced during the scene of events. So unfortunately, that didn't happen. So there's blame to share, but I just wanted to make sure we weren't leaving that piece out.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. And it's worth noting that, as many viewers will know, Thomas Hodgson, the sheriff in Bristol County, who's been a controversial figure for many years now, is currently seeking re-election, has a tough race against a Democrat, Paul Heroux. Thomas Hodgson has been backed by Governor Baker, who seems to be a fan of the work he's done there. Elizabeth, I want to ask you just briefly about another debate that's unfolding involving the way the state handles mental health in corrections settings. Tell me if I've got this right. There is a new law that was aimed at making it easier for an inmate who felt like they needed mental health treatment to get it, to request a transfer to a psychiatric facility. And Governor Baker, in a supplemental budget, has proposed a modification that would actually take away some agency from prisoners in those situations. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, it's a very good summary. He signed the healthcare omnibus bill, mental health omnibus bill, into law literally just weeks before the supplemental budget came out, where he was then undermining the mental health watch provisions in that law. What it allows for, and the problem, just to lay this out, is the Department of Justice under Trump in 2020 came out with a very scathing report about the state of mental health watch in Massachusetts specifically, because there's a very high correlation between people who are in mental health watch, suicidal ideation, and after mental health watch. So we hear time and again from our clients, if you didn't want to kill yourself before mental health watch, you'll want to kill yourself once you're in there or once you get out. And in fact, that's why there was such a high correlation of suicides happening for folks who are experiencing mental health watch. And that's because it is not used as a therapeutic setting. And as the DOJ stated, it is used as punishment. And so it's not surprising that Adam Howe was placed in a mental health watch cell, gets no therapeutic attention, right? He's in a high state of crisis. He might have been detoxing. We don't know all the details yet. He's put on a 15-minute watch, which is contrary to regular practice. Under those circumstances, there's no reason he shouldn't have been on an eyeball watch.
With constant attention.
Constant attention, yeah. Right, which is a constant watch. And so that law that you mentioned is really about, for people who are in prolonged mental health watch, which is not meant to be a long-term setting. We have clients who've been in mental health watch, suicide smock, no utensils, you're eating with your hands for months. Wow. It's not intended to be that kind of setting. And so the purpose of that law is to allow people who are in those conditions to petition to be in a psychiatric facility where they can actually get some therapeutic treatment.
I want to, okay, sorry to stop on you. Go ahead, Shelley. You get the last word here.
There is a school of thought that mental health watch in that context is pretty much solitary confinement by another name. Yes. That's how we would know it. And GOC doesn't have a really happy record, even under those circumstances. Remember, they lost probably their most famous prisoner, Aaron Hernandez, to suicide.
Bristol County Jail, right?
He was already at Susan Baranowski.
Oh, forgive me. Thank you.
Yeah,
he
the
was
most
at Bristol
secure facility there is in this state under a mental health watch. And I do believe the guard was fired, reprimanded, or whatever. I think there was a case of a sleeping guard in that instance. But getting back to the Justice Department report, which is horrifying. It is now 2 years. It will be next month. It will be the 2-year anniversary of that report. It is still, a settlement is still being negotiated. So we had we, as in the editorial board, had Rachel Rollins in just a week or so ago to ask what the deal is. And her take on it is, yes, we'll get back to you on that. We're still negotiating.
As you describe that, I just find myself thinking, here's another area where in Massachusetts, where we like to think of ourselves as very progressive and enlightened, there's a lot of work still to be done. Shelley Cohen, Elizabeth Matos, thank you both for talking through this very unpleasant topic.
Thank you so much for having us and for focusing on this.
Thanks, Adam.
Next up, when diehard Trump supporter Don Bolduc won the Republican primary, it was seen by many as good news for incumbent Maggie Hassan, who the Boston Globe had declared the most vulnerable Senate Democrat up for re-election at a time when every seat is crucial when it comes to Democrats holding on to the majority. After the primary, consensus among both parties was that Bolduc's more moderate opponent, Chuck Morse, would have been the stronger candidate in the general. But a month out from Election Day, the polls are a little too close for comfort for the Hassan campaign. She's up just 6 points over Bolduc in the latest survey from St. Anselm. And in a recent memo to donors obtained by Axios, Hassan's campaign warned that even those numbers may be soft, saying, quote, "Our own internal polling shows that Don Bolduc is quickly consolidating the Republican base and is rapidly making up ground." I'm joined now by former Democratic New Hampshire State Rep Arnie Arnesen, who hosts The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen on WNHN-FM, and by Fergus Cullen, former chair of the New Hampshire Republican Party from 2007 to 2008. Thank you both for joining me. Arnie, I want to start with you. Some of our viewers will know a lot about Maggie Hassan and Don Bolduc, particularly the ones who live in New Hampshire, and some of them won't know anything at all. Can you offer just a quick, broad brush description of these two candidates and how they compare to each other?
Maggie Hassan has been around since the beginning of Dawn. She has been a state senator. She was a governor. She is now sitting in the U.S. Senate. She's running as an incumbent. So if you imagine wallpaper, imagine Maggie Hassan. So we know her. We're familiar with her. She is the definition of moderation. Okay, that is exactly what she is. She's not wild. She's not extreme. She, in some ways, represents the purple that New Hampshire has become. That is the color for her. Don Bolduc has not been around for a long time. He ran for the U.S. Senate in the primary in 2020. He did not get endorsed by Donald Trump. He was a little ticked off about that. He obviously lost that primary. And again, Jeanne Shaheen won pretty easily in that Senate race. But he's been running since 2020. So let's be honest here. But he's been running, and he's a wild card. He's a retired brigadier general, Army. So he's a lot of high energy and looks very, very macho. But in a lot of ways, he's incredibly erratic. He's very conservative. He is, he's extreme in the sense of everything extreme that used to be what the Republican Party is or was. Now the Republican Party is more MAGA, it's more free stater, more libertarian. So he has that appeal, but he is definitely, I think, perceived as the unstable candidate, even by Republicans in Washington.
Just to give people a little taste of how Don Bolduc presents himself, I want to roll a very brief video from 2020, his last run, and then we'll come back to you, Fergus. Let's take a look.
General Don Bolduc.
I didn't spend my life defending this country to let a bunch of liberal socialist pansies squander it away. I'm Don Bolduc. I approve this message, and I'm asking for your vote.
He's Don Bolduc, and he approved that message. When I first saw that ad, I honestly thought it was a bit like a Saturday Night Live skit or something, but in fact it wasn't. Fergus, since Chuck Morse was seen, as I understand it, far and wide as the most viable candidate when it comes to Republicans picking up the seat, how did Don Bolduc manage to beat him?
Well, and I was a Morse supporter in the primary election. And look, Don has been running for U.S. Senate consecutively now for 3 years. He's been spending all that time talking to Republican primary voter audiences, the kinds of people who go to county Republican picnics, who may not be all that representative of the Republican Party, certainly not of centrist voters in New Hampshire. And so he's very raw. His strength is that he's genuine. He's authentic. He tells it like it is.
Or like he thinks it is, yeah.
This as well.
Am I correct that Democrats helped push Bolduc, or may have helped push Bolduc past Chuck Morse?
Oh, I think there's no question. They spent millions of dollars to try and pick their nominee, pick their opponent, and they were successful. Arnie described Senator Hassan as wallpaper. Look, there are 100 U.S. senators. They can't all be above average. And Senator Hassan is a below average U.S. senator. She's been very mediocre. I'm the city councilor in the 5th largest community in Dover. She has been invisible. She has not been around. She has not been present. She's just there. like wallpaper, and that's not a good thing.
Well, as people from outside New Hampshire watch this race, it seems to me that one of the huge questions it will raise is, has the Democratic Party been smart when it comes to trying to nudge more extreme candidates over the finish line in various Republican primaries, or have they not? It strikes me as a really risky strategy, especially because we know how that approach to politics played out in 2016. But I'm not a professional political consultant. Arnie, right after...
Let me comment on wallpaper,
Sure.
though, because there's something about wallpaper. You feel comfortable with it. You know it. It's familiar to you. You're looking at a situation now where everything is volatile, and you want something that resembles stability. The other thing that's also important here is that there is one thing where she will go to the mat on, and that is protecting Roe v. Wade. So, you know, when he said to Maggie Hassan, as Don Bolduc said after the Dobbs decision, get over it, Maggie, guess what? Every woman I know is not getting over it, and they're going to walk over Don Bolduc, and that's what's going to happen in the general election. Because you know what? That is too important to their lives, too important to their families, and too important to their future.
I was going to get to his statements on Roe and his sort of flippant summary of what he believes is Maggie Hassan's response to the reversal of Roe. I just want to make sure I'm clear here. You think Bolduc is going to lose badly, and you think that women who are pro-choice are going to vote en masse for Hassan? Is that what
So let me tell you something. I think he's going to lose. I'm not necessarily sure he's going to lose badly. One, he has Sununu at the top of the ticket where he's hoping he can hold on to his coattails. But more importantly, you know what's Bolduc's advantage is? They're going to spend millions and millions of dollars, that Washington establishment, to protect and preserve Bolduc. Bolduc is running against Washington, but Washington is going to dump millions and millions of dollars to basically craft an image of Bolduc that he couldn't craft for himself. So if he comes even close to Maggie, it's not because he's running as Don Bolduc, but Washington is basically attacking Maggie and creating this impression of a Bolduc that frankly doesn't exist.
Washington, I assume in this case, meaning, according to you, Republicans in Washington. This is not
as in Mitch McConnell. As in Mitch McConnell and
Fergus,
related family.
I want to ask you about, Arnie brought up the question of Bolduc's image and how he's trying to craft it or maybe trying to recraft it. He has been, it seems to me, all over the map on the question of the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election. I want to roll a couple pieces of video, one in which he said one thing, one in which he says something very different, and then we'll talk about where he's landed now, which is, I think, in a third spot.
You know, live and learn, right? And I've done a lot of research on this, and I have come to the conclusion, and I want to be definitive on this. The election was not stolen. Was there fraud? Yes. Unfortunately, President Biden is the legitimate president of this country.
I signed a letter with 120 other generals and admirals saying that Trump won the election, and damn it, I stand by my election.
So there we have Don Bolduc immediately after the primary, and then I think about a month earlier where he was saying something very different. And now, if I've got this right, a couple days ago, he told a voter at an event in Hudson, he's triangulating. He's figured out a new position to hold. He said, I can't say that it was stolen or not. I don't have enough information, but what I can say is that we have irregularity. Fergus, do you think that the voters who might vote for Don Bolduc care about him evolving and then evolving again on this, or do they not?
Well, the answer is probably not, but this is an example of the fact that he's not a practiced, polished politician. He's not an experienced candidate, and that means he is mistake prone. So Occam's razor prevails here. The simplest explanation is probably the best. He does believe the election was stolen.
Yeah.
His original position is his real position. Now, will voters care about this? I don't know. I personally care about it. Integrity of the elections is sort of a threshold issue for me. People who don't take the election results as true is something I have a hard time dealing with. But nonetheless, I'm not sure that's going to be the pivotal issue in this. But it's an example of how he is an inexperienced candidate who has spent all this time just talking to Republican primary voters.
Yeah.
You start an impression that they represent what everybody thinks, and that's just not true.
That is interesting. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but that makes a lot of sense. Arnie, as you know, we have a Republican candidate for governor here in Massachusetts, Jeff Deal, who was ready to primary Charlie Baker from the right if Baker had sought a third term. Deal was an early Trump backer. He has come to the conclusion that the election was stolen after initially saying that it wasn't and that people who are upset about the results need to move on. I'm wondering, between Jeff Deal in Massachusetts, Don Bolduc in New Hampshire, and then I want to get Fergus's take on this, but is it time to give up on the idea that moderate New England Republicanism is a thing? Let's start with you, Arnie, the Democrat, and then we'll go to the Republican.
Oh my God, it died about 7 years ago. Well, actually, for New Hampshire, it died when the Free Staters moved into the state and started taking over the Republican Party. The Republican Party was somewhat hollowed out, and they stepped into the void there, like these extreme uber-libertarians that want to secede. So understand, we pre-exist MAGA and Donald Trump, so we really are the fertile ground for the demise of the Republican Party. But I just want to go back to one other thing about the position of Don Bolduc on the big lie. He's got now another answer, just in case you missed it. And the other answer is he actually believes that Joe Biden was legitimately elected. Do you know why? Because he wants to go to Washington so he can impeach him.
Or tell me if I've got this right.
If he wasn't there, he wasn't going to be. He couldn't impeach someone who wasn't legitimately elected. So he has to be legitimately elected.
You need to say he was legitimately elected so that you can take the appropriate sanction. Got it. In addition to doing whatever you're going to do to go after
That's the fourth variation.
No, thank you.
That's the fourth variation.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So Fergus, as someone who I think is very committed to the ideal of moderate republicanism, do you see yourself as part of a dying breed?
Well, look, parties are allowed to change, and the New Hampshire Republican Party and the party is across the country certainly has. You know, the party I led in 2007, 2008 that nominated John McCain for president doesn't exist anymore. I don't recognize the Republican Party. But listen, until the Republicans start losing elections significantly and consecutively, there's no reason for them to change. It took a bunch of defeats by Walter Mondale and Governor Dukakis before Bill Clinton was able to convince the Democratic Party that they had to change. It takes defeat in order for that to happen. Parties are allowed to change, and they have. Now, getting back to these, election integrity and such, look, I'm not advising General Bolduc's campaign, but any minute he is not talking about inflation and the economy and economic anxiety, he is losing, or he's at least not talking about the issues that voters care about, including rising energy prices and electricity prices in New Hampshire. So, this is an example of him just not being disciplined, not being an experienced candidate. He's trying to stick to the script, but he's really having trouble doing so.
You talk about how it basically takes losing to change what you're doing. I know there's speculation here in Massachusetts that if Republicans just face a complete wipeout, the party might head back toward the center a little bit compared to where it's gone in recent years. I'm not sure, given the direction of the party. If it's working nationally, I could see it taking a little bit of time to realign. Before we close, Fergus, I'll stay with you, give you the last word. We got Arnie's prediction. What do you think is going to happen in this race?
Well, Senator Hassan was barely elected by just 1,000 votes 6 years ago. She has not distinguished herself. She's still under 50%. This election is really not about General Bolduc. It's about President Biden, the direction of the country, the fact that Senator Hassan has been so mediocre. That's going to make it competitive. She has the advantage. She got the opponent she wanted. That's probably worth a couple of marginal points. It might be enough to put her over the top.
We got to leave it there. Unfortunately,
it's also about Dobbs. Sorry.
No, that's a fair thing to sneak in at the end. Thank you both for talking this. So I guess it comes down to what you think of wallpaper, right? Do you like wallpaper? Do you dislike wallpaper? Arnie Arnesen, Fergus Cullen. Thanks again. That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. And as always, please tell us what you think. The email's talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics, or you can find me on Twitter. I'm @ReillyAdam. For now, thank you for watching, and good night.
It's critical.